Right, I have with me two students, and here on my left I've got Claire, and on my right I've got David. David and Claire, we're going to look for 5 kinds of question in some trial data. This is data from the Harold Shipman trial, and we're going to look for each of the 5 question types that I've just identified. And while we're doing that, what I'd like us to do is to think about if we have any difficulties in identifying these question types. Are there any problematic cases? And you can point me to those as we go through. So let's have a look first of all for WH questions. These are questions that have a question word in them: what, where, when, why, or how. So they're really quite easy to locate, aren't they? Let's have a look for some of these questions. Let's start with an example from David.
For example, why should you write a prescription out for 30 milligrams of diamorphine for Lillian Ibbotson?
Okay, so this is very clearly a why question, isn't it? And because we know from the grammar of questions that the question word comes at the beginning, they're quite easy to find. Let's have a look for yes-no questions then. Yes-no questions have the inversion of the subject and the verb, so we're looking for questions that begin with a verb. What examples can you find, Claire?
So I've got, was that a complaint of which you were told by Mrs. Grundy?
Okay, so we've got the verb at the beginning here. Was that a complaint? Any difficulties in identifying these 2 kinds of questions then? WH questions and yes-no questions. WH questions are quite straightforward, aren't they, because they have the WH word, so we can easily categorise these. But what about yes-no questions?
Well, for example, can you please tell the court what occurred at the consultation between the 2 of you? Structurally, that is a yes-no question. Yes, I can. Yes, I am able to tell you. But it's obviously wanting a more descriptive answer than yes or no.
Yes, if somebody asks you, can you tell the court X, and you say yes, it doesn't sound like the right answer,
No.
does it? So there's some questions then that seem to be grammatically structured as yes-no questions, but are expecting more than yes or no. And what we're getting into here is pragmatics of questions. So we're going beyond the grammatical structure to the way that they're used, aren't they? And what we know is expected in the way that the question's asked. And part of the way we know how much we have to respond to that question is because of the setting. So in a courtroom setting, if we're asked, can you do X, then we know that we need to do some explanation of some kind. That's related to the role of the questioner and the questioned. The questioned person is there to provide answers, not simply to respond to the grammatical function of the question. It would be obstructive, perhaps, just to say yes, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Any other difficulties? So that's an interesting case, isn't it? This question, yes-no question, that's not simply looking for a yes or no. So we might want to have 2 categories of yes-no questions: those that are looking for a yes or a no, and those that are pragmatically actually looking for information. Okay? And if we're to divide questions into 2 types, those that are information seeking, the WH questions, or confirmation seeking, the yes-no questions, sometimes the confirmation seeking ones are actually seeking information, so it's obviously a bit more complicated than that. We haven't got any examples of alternative questions in our data at all, in the trial data that we've been looking at. But what about tag questions? Have we got any examples of tag questions? And if so, are there any difficulties in identifying these, or any interesting features of these questions that we want to talk about?
There's an interesting one that says, if that were the truth, that would represent what most GPs would say, would it not?
What's interesting about that particular question?
That it coerces and restricts Harold Shipman to answering a yes or no, but it also puts his opinion against most GPs. So then questions his credibility as a medical practitioner.
So what we're looking at there is the function of the question in this particular setting. What's it aiming to do? That's a very interesting resource that's available to people who are using tag questions. Yeah. Have you got an example of a tag question?
Yeah, I've also got, well, you heard her evidence, didn't you, on oath that she never received such diamorphine?
What's interesting about that one, Claire?
Well, it is seeking confirmation, but it's also kind of accusing him and taking that confirmation so that the lawyer can then twist that into whichever portrayal they want to make of him to their advantage.
And formally, this the design of this question is slightly different from the ones that we've used in the example and in David's previous example, isn't it? Because the tag, the didn't you, is in the middle of the question. Can you read it again so we can hear that?
Yeah, well, you heard her evidence, didn't you, on oath that she never received such diamorphine?
So does the tag coming in the middle produce this accusation perhaps a bit more than if it's just at the end? Because if the tag is at the end, it's seeking a yes or no, but here the question goes on to do something else, doesn't it? It's interesting, isn't it, that we hear it and you've interpreted it as more of an accusation than a confirmation-seeking question, and so it's doing both, isn't it? But the placement of the tag in the middle perhaps is part of that. We would need to look at more examples, wouldn't we, to do that? And this is the interesting part about looking at examples in text, isn't it? Because what we can see then is we're not just looking at form, but we're looking at how form is constructed in particular situations to do things that the grammar doesn't tell us the question is doing. It's not simply seeking confirmation, this one, is it? It's doing something else at the same time. What about our final category then, declarative questions? Should we have a look at some examples of these?
Just a straightforward one. You wrote the prescription out?
Okay. And you've used question intonation with that one. But declarative questions can have rising intonation or not. You can one of the ways that we recognise it as a question in the trial is that every other turn is a question, really, isn't it? All of the format of examination of witnesses in trials is question and answer. So we recognise it as a witness as asking a question, whatever the form of it is.
That could simply be you wrote the prescription out with no rising intonation. Exactly.
Yeah.
We've also got a bit of a problematic one here when the lawyer says, now I am going to ask you whether you admit that you yourself had any of the diamorphine that is referred to in that formal admission bundle.
So you've said that that's a declarative question. What's problematic about that then?
I think it's because within the question the lawyer is stating, I am going to ask you, and there is the WH of whether, but really on the form side of things, she is just, or he or her is just narrating that is what they intend to do.
Okay, so it's a statement. Formally it's a statement, isn't it?
But really it's functioning as the question, does he admit that he himself had any of that diamorphine?
And the other interesting thing in that question from a linguistic point of view is the you say part, isn't it? Because here the question is relating the question to something that they've said beforehand. And this is the interesting thing about another interesting thing, isn't it, about looking at questions in use, is that we notice certain lexical patterns in questions. One of the things that we can see in this question is this you say formula. How frequent is that in questions, and does it make a difference to the way that the question is understood? Okay, when we come to look at data, we find that there are some terms, some spoken terms, that are difficult to classify because because the question doesn't really capture everything that the questioner is asking for. One of these examples is here, and it begins with quite a long narrative and then an "is that right?" short WH question. So the question here is whether you treat the long narrative that comes before "is that right?" as part of the question or not. Okay, so I'll just read out one of these. That is October 1996, and then I'm afraid going back to the computerised records which we find on the 489B, it would seem, Dr. Shipman, that the next occasion upon which Mrs. Grundy attended the surgery was the 12th of April 1997, because there we have another entry and then he goes on to explain something else. And then, is that right? Okay, so what we have is quite a long narrative in declarative form, and then a short, is that right? So saying is that right is a yes-no question doesn't really capture all of that information beforehand that's being referred to in the cohesive item that, which refers back, doesn't it, to the entire statement that's been made earlier. So it's fairly straightforward to find examples of all of the kinds of question, but when we look at data, we might find some problematic or interesting cases that we want to investigate a little bit further.